All right, well, welcome everyone. This is the first event of the APEX season for spring 2018. For those of you who were with us last semester, welcome back. And for those of you who may be new to watching this series, welcome for the first time. My name is Dr. Lynn Vartan, and I'm the director of the series, and we are so excited for you to be here today. Typically, our first event of the spring season is our Distinguished Faculty Lecture, which is in partnership with the Grace A. Tanner Center and as well as our Faculty Senate and members of the committee. Faculty scholars from campus can submit a proposal, and then those proposals are reviewed, and the winning proposal is our Distinguished Faculty Lecture for the year. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Dr. Ravi Roy is the director of the W. Edwards Deming Incubator for Public Affairs at SUU and has been director of various postgraduate programs, including MPA programs at SUU and also Cal State Northridge in California. He also worked at the International Development Program at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and was a visiting research scholar at the Orfalea Center for Global Studies at UC Santa Barbara. He was also awarded a certificate of recognition from the President of Indonesia for participating in Indonesia Tour 2025. One of the exciting things about him and shows his great educational capabilities is that he's participated and organized many roundtables, panels, and workshops involving global studies and political science. And he loves to inspire and support students to reach their full potential. His topic today and his passion for the public arena and the values of democracy are so timely and so informative as we embark on the new year. If you'd like to hear more, we also have a new radio show every Thursday at 3 p.m. and Dr. Roy will be our first live station guest, and we'll be continuing the discussion today on Thunder 91.1. But for now, here he is live in person. It's my great honor to present the 2018 Faculty Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Ravi Roy.
Welcome and thank you for attending. This is really humbling and nice. To modify a phrase that our great George Washington once started a speech with in New York, if you'll permit me to put on my spectacles, I've not only grown weary, but also blind in the service of my university. It goes with age, I guess. So it is truly an honor to be invited to give this year's Grace A. Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecture. And I would like to dedicate this year's talk to a person who I admire greatly, a person who embodies the very notion of public service itself, whose career serves as an example of what it means to earn the public trust, something that is desperately needed and is the focus of my talk today. This person is the late Senator Bob Bennett. Mr. Bennett placed public service ahead of personal gain and our nation's concerns ahead of partisanship. Whatever our partisan affiliations may be, or whether we have any at all, I think we can all come to an agreement, a consensus, that we need more public servants like Bob Bennett. Before I continue, I would like to recognize Paula Mitchell and Danielle Dabrowski and their respective teams, including Jessica Murdoch, the Grace A. Tanner Distinguished Faculty Lecture Committee, Lynn Vartan and her team, Roxanne Kalu, and Jordan Nielsen for making today's event possible. It's really nice to be able to have these events, to be able to be involved in them and see how well this university gels together and all the teamwork that goes on behind the scenes to put such events together. And it's really gratifying to be able to work in such a place. I would also like to thank distinguished guests, colleagues, especially our students, for your attendance here today. I would also like to express heartfelt thanks to my friends, President Scott Wyatt, Provost Bradley Cook, and Dean Britt Mace. As my betters, your dedicated service to the university is not only inspiring and helps set an example for us to aspire to great public service, but perhaps more importantly, helps keep me and my colleagues gainfully employed. And while I hope that you find today's remarks enjoyable, or at least they don't disappoint you, let me be candid in saying I'm pitching today's talk specifically to our undergraduate students. in whose hands our future relies. And Nicoletta, 12 years old, I hope you're paying attention to Daddy, and he hopes that he doesn't disappoint you today. My remarks today will examine the need for rebuilding public trust, the causes behind, or at least some of the causes behind its erosion over the past 50 years, and what we on a micro level as individuals can do to help rebuild it, because it's so essential, as we're going to talk about today, to the survival of our republic. In that vein, I will first share my personal concerns about the negative views that many Americans today hold about their government and their public officials. Having done this, I will provide some historical background on why public trust is vital to the maintenance of our democratic republic, and why we cannot continue as we have been. Next, I will examine some of the forces that are currently dividing our nation and how this is placing our republic in peril. Deeply concerning things. Finally, I will discuss why Americans of all political persuasions and stripes must begin working together immediately to restore unity within our nation so that our republic remains sound for the next 200 years. While preparing for today's talk, I asked my mentor and chair, Doug Bennett, for some words of advice to help ease in today's serious and difficult topic on rebuilding trust in public governance. And Doug suggested that I might open with a political joke. He said this has always worked well for him given his service in Washington. However, I responded sternly, I don't approve of political jokes. This is not because I teach politics or because I love it so much. You know, a subject that I've been trying to get students encouraged with for over 20 years, but because I find political jokes offensive because too many political jokes get elected too often of the time. That remark, which I lifted from late-night TV personality Jon Stewart, may seem frightfully cynical to some. Unfortunately, it reflects all too often how many of us feel about our government, and even worse, those earnest public servants who work so hard, day in and day out, to try to make the republic a livable place. As someone who has spent the majority of his adult life, I'm sure you can understand, devoted to preparing trustworthy, competent, and compassionate public servants, it's understandable that I find such comments disheartening and disillusioning on occasion. And it is on occasion that I have sought consolation in the possibility that all educators and my peers, no matter what their subject, may have felt similarly at some point in their teaching careers. But any temporary solace that I might have taken in the idea that all of us must feel the same way is quickly sobered by the hardening empirical facts, which is that survey after survey confirms that public trust in government has been steadily eroding since the 1960s, which then leads us into the current paradox. As you can see, government continues to grow in response to our expectations. As we expect government to grow, and government tries to meet those expectations simultaneously, during the same period, erosion of public trust has also been occurring. So in other words, the more we demand of government, the more it tries to meet those demands, and the less satisfied we are with the job that it is doing. The image of the disassociated, complacent, fat cat bureaucrat is no longer, I fear, just a caricature fit for political satire, but rather a scathing indictment and scathing characterization of what we think about our public servants today. Just look at some of these comments. I'm sure they'll resonate with all of you. But exaggerated though they may be, these sentiments should not be casually dismissed or ignored. The historic momentum behind Donald Trump's populist campaign to drain the political swamp, and think about the graphics that conjures in our minds, in Washington, and make America great again, as though we're somehow fallen, illustrates the extent to which people distrust and are unhappy with government. The fact that so many Americans feel that their government has let them down is deeply concerning. And this, I want to impress upon all of us today, does not bode well for the maintenance of our republic and its ability to thrive. After all, public trust and its activities is essential in a republic that is based on consent of the governed and the pleasure of those who, and exists at the pleasure of those whom it governs. It's necessary, indeed, to a well-functioning democracy. Russell Dalton has noted trends of increasing political distrust that, quote, may erode the vitality of democracy or eventually may undermine the democratic process itself. Now, to be sure, Americans have valid reasons to be unhappy with their government. When one considers political scandals, particularly since Watergate, political corruption that it almost appears in the news daily, negative campaigning, which actually seems to work, perceptions of the electoral process is rigged, political system is now captured by a few whose only motivation is to hold on to it. As my good friend and colleague Professor Fitzpatrick often reminds me, the Soviet Politburo had more turnover than our U.S. Congress does. History warns us that we should be mindful not to take democracy for granted. Concerns over both the viability and even the desirability were raised by the Greeks. Oh, what am I doing? Whoops. Oop. Help. Oh, try this. Oh. All right, there we go. Were raised by the Greeks, some going back to 400 BCE. And Aesop, the fabulist, once remarked this: assertions that the people were incapable of governing themselves continued to be widespread well into the 17th century and used to lend legitimacy to arguments supporting the notion of royal absolutism and the divine right of kings. Indeed, in the 1970s movie Cromwell, King Charles I, played by Sir Alec Guinness, yes, Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars, made an assertion in that movie that I'll never forget, in which he said, democracy is a Greek drollery based on the foolish notion that there were extraordinary possibilities in very ordinary people. And while I've been unable to confirm the historical authenticity of that quote, the sentiments of that time were well known and certainly valid at that time. Even America's beloved founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, had their concerns about the viability of democracy and whether or not the republic was capable of enduring for an extended period of time. We all are familiar with Ben Franklin's comments outside of Independence Hall in 1787 when he emerged to a bunch of anxious citizens who were wondering to know, did we have a monarchy? And he replied, "Madam, a republic, if you can keep it." Those were words. Those were words. Perhaps it would have been more appropriate if Ben Franklin said a democratic republic, if you can keep it, because it is in the democracy that it is the two-edged sword. Precious, important, worth defending, but not guaranteed, and certainly not axiomatic. In that vein, Immanuel Kant in 1795 proposed that constitutional republics, along with a variety of other factors, here are some of them, were necessary for securing both international and domestic peace. Along with Adam Smith's writings on free exchange and open commerce, the enlightened principles promulgated in the 17th and 18th centuries collectively inspired a new wave of cosmopolitanism, and even moral norms which emphasize freedom and universal human community. the very values and principles that were sympathetic with the rise of a new bourgeois middle class. In the 20th century, a new liberal or neoliberal consensus began to emerge, which viewed democracy and free markets as essentially two sides of the same coin, consistent with what would become known as the liberal peace thesis that was largely built or conceptualized by Kant, or based on his principles, which proposed that bourgeois democratic regimes by their ontology, or by their nature, possess a mutual commitment to human rights, political liberty, and free markets. Accordingly, liberal peace theorists viewed democratic regimes as natural allies, and therefore were less likely to go to war with one another. They were even less so, their neoliberal counterparts argued, if their economies were linked together through international trade and foreign direct investment. The more countries engaged with one another based on shared cosmopolitan values, the more likely they would to spread domestic peace and tranquility and international as the same. Accordingly, in the later part of the 20th century, globalists like Michael Mandelbaum, the book featured here, reasoned that with the fall of Soviet-led communism, the principles underlying the free market capitalism and liberal democracy would be universally embraced throughout the world. New wealth and prosperity generated through global engagements would in turn be expected to create a new bourgeois social class, but this time now in the developing world, just like it had in the developed world. That would naturally be sympathetic to democratic systems of government. However, with the benefit of time and experience, such claims have become much more nuanced and conditional. Nevertheless, the claim that success of bourgeois constitutional democracies hinges upon a robust middle class remains valid to this day, and we can ill afford to ignore that claim. In other words, lose the support of the middle class or lose the middle class altogether, even worse, ultimately constitutional democratic republics will falter. They cannot stand. While globalization has brought with it many blessings, including economic growth that has helped fuel the rise of a new global class, most notably in the BRIC countries, as we can see, as well as empowering traditionally disenfranchised groups in developing countries such as women in Asia and Africa through new forms of internationally sourced finance, it has simultaneously produced turbulence and uncertainty on an unprecedented scale. The costs and benefits of globalization have been felt unevenly across nations and has augmented disparities between the rich and the poor within them. Most importantly, unemployment stemming from the outsourcing of labor and technology has been destabilizing the middle class in the developed countries. That means right here at home, folks. The very socioeconomic group, the middle class, upon which bourgeois democratic regimes hinge. Declining levels of public trust, therefore, are in large part a result of the diminishing capacity of governments to shield their middle-class citizens from the fallout of devastating international financial crises, massive violence associated with global terrorism, resulting from sudden waves of cross-border and transcontinental migration, and a variety of other factors. These type of images are now etched in the American mindset, and these are the concerns of the middle class and what is affecting them on a very real and visceral level. Adding to the nation's growing sense of insecurity is that the bottom 40% of this country has not received a real wage increase since the late 1970s. Most recently, President Trump's tax cuts, aimed primarily at helping American business compete in a cutthroat global economy, has unnerved large segments of the middle-class population. Growing numbers of people are concerned that these tax cuts have not provided sufficient relief for America's already beleaguered and forgotten middle class. This is not good, as I said before. The decline of the middle class as a middle-of-the-road political consensus that took so long to build, that culminated in the 1930s, and that moved all forward for decades after that, has led to extreme factionalism between left and right. Growing uncertainty and anxiety associated with global turbulence is serving to galvanize deep political social cleavages within our nation's economy. Fueled uncertainty, suspicion, and mistrust, which I fear is driving a septic wedge within our precious bourgeois society. In Fellow's paper number 10, written by James Madison, he warns us the impulse of our passions may cause us to take actions that are abhorrent to the Constitution and run contrary to the good of the Republic over which it presides. The most direct threat to democracy, I would suggest then, is not posed by foreign conspirators from abroad, but rather from domestic political factions in pursuit of their mutually exclusive interests. Today, our posture of putting political parties and partisanship first above the good of the Republic and our fellow Americans is keeping us from working together to get things done as we once had. Has kept us from reaching a critical consensus on important issues that are in the interest of the nation as a whole. As we can see, Madison saw that there's a relationship between property, wealth, and the nature of its distribution and the stability of the Republic. And I'll let my good friend again, Professor Fitzpatrick, correct me on this, but I think he might have been echoing Aristotle on that point. Well, I believe that a healthy dose of cynicism of government authority and a reasonable amount of political dissent within our society are elements in any free democratic republic, and the political parties make it possible for competing interests and views to be effectively represented. At the same time, the divisive potentialities built into them have to be tempered, have to be sobered, have to heed the mild voice of reason. And while any attempt to silence dissenting views or diversity of opinion would be an assault on liberty itself, such differences must be expressed thoughtfully and constructively. Again, the paradox. If public trust is to be restored, the government as a whole will have to function much better. Nobody denies this. That said, if excessive levels of political division persist, the Republic will become paralyzed. Take, for example, right now, the budget situation that we're in. Governments shutting down, really? In a bourgeois, consensus-based democracy, this is not good, especially when the dollar is the reserve currency to the entire world's global banking system. We're talking about the potential of major global meltdown if full faith and credit is not guaranteed through our political system. Currently, deep factional cleavages within our republic prevent constructive dialogue from taking place, thus making consensus and compromise extremely difficult. We need to put the republic ahead of political party, and that means we have to begin with ourselves. Perhaps we should heed the word of the founder of the largest democracy in the world, which is India, where Mohandas K. Gandhi said, if we could change ourselves, the tendency in the world would also change. Right now, each side is characterizing the other along partisan lines, and I think P.J. O'Rourke, the satirist, famously remarked, Democrats are the party that says the government will make you smarter, taller, richer, and remove the crabgrass in your lawn. Republicans, on the other hand, are the party that says government doesn't work, and then they get elected to prove it. Such characterizations reflect the popular sentiments in the opposing parties, but they are not helpful. They may be true, they may be true in the sense of how one party characterizes the other, but this is not a good characterization, and this is not good for the Republic. Perhaps when regarding the other, we would listen to, if both sides of the political fence heard the words of Alex de Tocqueville, who eloquently remarked, there are many men of principle in both parties in America, but there is no party of principle. So what's the solution then? We must recognize that defining public trust is problematic. That's the first thing. It's not an easy thing. And we need to be able to address, before we can address this issue, we have to understand what we're talking about. Public trust is an elusive term. It's an elusive concept, and it's complicated. And when I was preparing this speech and going through the literature once again, having revisited it from a previous book that I'd done, I again became baffled in trying to map out this concept in a useful and simple way. And to be honest with you, there was no way to do it. So restoring public trust admittedly will not be easy. On the most basic level, public trust can be distinguished between specific perceptions that citizens may hold about their politicians and more abstract perceptions that they may hold about government as a whole. And they're not consistent, nor are they inconsistent in any consistent way. Recent data indicates that our belief in democratic ideals and democracy tends to remain robust. Well, that's good, right? So democracy in the abstract, we still believe in that. We're not the only ones. This is true across both the data shows in the developing world as well as in other developed countries as well. Well, our trust in government, sadly, at least broadly speaking, has been declining. So we like the idea of democracy. We just don't like the result that democracy produces, apparently. The message here is that the subject of public trust is very complex, and we need to at least be aware of this fact. Self-awareness is a first start. Our schizophrenic perceptions of government are part of the problem itself and play out in the results, maybe, that we get. Ultimately, elected public officials serve at the pleasure of the voters. That's the whole principle of consent of the governed. Under this logic, it has been suggested that Americans end up with the government that they deserve. And the data confirms that re-election rates for incumbent candidates is generally somewhere between 70, 80%, even higher, and so on and so forth. There could be many reasons for this. First of all, many dissatisfied citizens either do not vote or end up voting for the lesser of the two evils. Sound familiar? Latest election cycle. Based on candidates of the two major parties have made available to them on the ballot. So it's been suggested that part of this problem is systemic. Other voters, however, may vote with stronger conviction for particular candidates that they generally like, while still remaining dissatisfied with government as a whole. The research on public trust, though, is revealing some interesting phenomenon. Breakthroughs in modern biological science are beginning to provide some very interesting insights that possibly could help us with this paradox. Experimental economics, led by this gentleman, Vernon Smith, in different experimental scenarios, is helping us to understand how and why people trust one another and how consensus is built. More recently, building on this work has been revolutionary work of Dr. Paul Zak, also known as Dr. Love, because of his study of the molecule called oxytocin. And in his experimental research, he has been able to, first of all, show that high-trust countries tend to be well-performing countries. High-trust countries, when they work well through democracies, produce greater forms of wealth and better social cohesion. In a phone conversation that I had with Paul a few weeks back, he helped me also gain some, at least introductory insight, that the human brain, according to the experiments that he's been doing with oxytocin and trust, is that the human brain is not necessarily set up in a way to be able to reconcile some of these contradictions and paradoxes that we've been discussing. So, for example, one of the things that we discussed was why people love their congressperson but then hate Congress, right? In survey after survey, we show that incumbents return very often. We discussed that part of that may be epiphenomenal, but look at our own politicians right here in Utah. We genuinely like them. The survey shows this, and we returned them to office, but we're not generally happy with Congress as a whole. So our incredulity is part of the problem also. Why do we think government can, we don't think the government can do much, and then are surprised when government lets us or meets our expectations by letting us down? The level of public trust that we place in government is in part conditional upon whether we believe that government officials are competent and possess the capacity to deliver on their promises. The catch-22 is that in a Republican representative democracy, government that does not carry the trust of the people, by definition, lacks the mandate to get bold things done. Hence the paralysis. The wherewithal to govern effectively is derived from the consent of the governed, as I've mentioned many times, and when government is perceived to be ineffective, it lacks public confidence and the political support to act decisively. Americans are not alone, by the way, in their growing incredulity towards governing authorities. In 2014, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, asserted that, quote, public negativity about politics and politicians across European countries was the single largest challenge to the stability of the Eurozone. The message here is that we must recognize that government failure is at least in part the result of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As we move forward, we must change our political temperament and culture. Admittedly, this is much easier said than done. To begin with, voters need to replace their fascination with political spectacle and TV personalities with a desire to develop a deeper understanding of substantive policy issues and vote accordingly. You cannot vote your interests if you do not know what your options are and you don't have a clear understanding of the information and how to decipher it, interpret, and apply it. Voters need to begin turning their attention away from shallow, divisive, partisan rhetoric and towards substantive issues based on the rational thought and sober analysis, again, of what Joseph Bissett calls the mild voice of reason. When we resort to bellicose rhetoric that is steeped in fear-mongering and ad hominem attacks, genuine dialogue is impossible, and whatever begins gets quickly extinguished. Okay. So what can we do on a practical level as individuals to rebuild trust? Well, Robert Putnam, who wrote a popular book called Bowling Alone, has shown that there is a relationship between declining civic engagement and declining levels of public trust. The resorting back to individualism, not getting out in the community, no longer bowling in leagues, but voting as as individuals, is also related, the same kind of lack of civic engagement is related to decline in public engagement and hence public trust. So in other words, even as we privatize our leisure with home theaters and don't go out to the movie theater, all of that is part of this social phenomenon. We need to be cognizant of this and begin re-engaging with one another in constructive dialogues in constructive ways. The more we increasingly withdraw from interacting in public settings and engaging in public participation, the more likely we are to mistrust one another and mistrust government and our public officials. Getting involved, participating, getting educated, that's all part of it. So, it seems that watching television helps produce feelings of insecurity, distrust, and more cynical views towards politics and society. I read a survey somewhere, I couldn't believe this, but the average American now spends up to 14 hours a day in social media, television, and other kinds of individualistic kind of face screen activity. And this is having an effect. So what can we do? Take a political science class. Yes, I know this last one seems a bit self-serving given my occupation. But it turns out the more we know about politics, the more we study politics, the more moderate our views become and the more charitable and honest we come about those who disagree with us. That's true. Get involved. This is to the young people in this room. You are the future. That's what this individual has done. We can take a cue from this guy. Brazilian 29-year-old Daniel Jose Oliveira got a scholarship to study economics as an undergraduate and then got a Yale scholarship, a J.P. Morgan scholarship to go to Yale University. And rather than go work for a big investment house right out of college, right out of grad school, or an investment bank, he decided to go back to his own country when His country was mired in one political scandal after the other. Its economy was collapsing. We need the best and the brightest not to leave college, then go run a business, which is a very noble thing, and then go into politics. But we need you when you're fresh, young, full of ideas, full of idealism, and go out there and do that first like this gentleman did. And he is having an effect. And we're talking about a country where nearly 40% of the congressmen in his own country are under investigation, 40%. 3% of the population approve of the current president, Michel Temer. However, Oliveira is changing public attitudes towards government and public service, especially among Brazil's youth, who are growing inspired and hopeful that they can change things for the better. And you can do the same. I believe that. I've worked with the bright students since 2004 in political science. I know what our students are capable of. I'm encouraging you. I'm challenging you. Lead us forward. In closing, rebuilding public trust will involve reuniting the country, and the best place to start is by focusing on what we have in common. Remind ourselves of the ideals of our great founding and the consensus that even though there was great discussions, great divisions over things, there were also common core things that they were able to settle on and build and erect this marvelous republic on. Let us not squander that legacy, I beg you. After all, it is our shared belief in our country and the common struggle to make it a more perfect union that has allowed us to flourish for so long. Let our differences be vetted in a civil and constructive manner, so that our children's varied opinions become a source of strength rather than a source of discord and dysfunction. Let us instill these values in our children. Nicole, I hope I haven't let you down in that respect. But let's do this. Let's pass on these traditions. Let us be vigilant in how we do it. Let us be particular. Let us be deliberate. Our marvelous republic will be the better for it. Trust me. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roy. This is a little bit of a Q&A portion. We'll spend just maybe 10 or 15 minutes just getting into some of these topics a little bit deeper. The first question I'd like to ask you, and I love the call to action that you sort of give there at the end of your talk. And could you elaborate a little more? Perhaps we have some students in the audience who are really curious. They maybe have a budding passion for getting involved in the political arena, but don't quite know where to start. Do you have some thoughts for them in this town of how they could get going?
Well, Doug and Mary, I'm going to give you another plug because our Levitt Center is very much engaged with real-world application and is marvelous about plugging our students into internships in Salt Lake City, in county government, and all the way to Washington, D.C. We have really a powerhouse couple that have been in that world, and they kind of remind me of the couple, the odd couple of Mary Madeline and James Carville, in the sense that you got the best of both worlds of left and right together, and they have been marvelous in placing our students in some really key positions and getting some really great experience. So the Levitt Center, if I could give that plug, is a marvelous resource.
And I also echo that. I'm looking forward to some partnerships with them and APEX in the future. And so anybody in the audience interested in getting involved, just stop by. Stop by the Levitt Center and the Student Center and see what you can do, see how you can get involved. Another demographic, a group of students that are in the audience is, I'm so excited that we have a lot of international students in the audience. Thank you so much to you all who are here, and also to the faculty members who are encouraging their students to attend. That's awesome. For those who might be new or studying here for the first semester and interested in how things work and maybe want to get more information, do you have any advice for that group of people?
Yeah, I mean, we have a wonderful group of folks in our political science department, and their doors are always open. And we welcome anyone at any time to come in and meet with us. As I said, Doug Bennett is the chair of the department. I know he's always meeting with students. I know my colleagues are as well. And we have a very strong interest in politics and politics background among our CJ faculty as well. who their knowledge of politics often outweighs my own, and they're a marvelous group to work with as well. Also, some of our faculty in sociology as well.
Great. So again, just if you want to get more involved, those are some places that you can start looking. A little bit of a sort of personal passion question. I just love the passion to which you speak to political science and government and these topics. How did that spark in you? Has it always been there? Is it a certain person? Where did that come from?
Well, I confess with a little bit of blushing here, it's kind of a family business. My dad was a political science professor for over 50 years, half a century. And I can't help but think that him being a leftist and me being more moderate created, as my colleague Dan Swanson says, do you think you went into this to kind of show the old man up? And I said, well, maybe that has something to do with it. Love the man, but yeah, I think sure. And I learned so much from him and his mentorship. And he was someone that came from India on a Fulbright scholarship, and he was in love with America. And he is 83 years old. He's been to SUU. He's lectured in our political science classes. And since we're in the season of it, he marched with Martin Luther King in Mississippi in the 1960s. And so, yeah, I think some of that rubbed off.
Wow. Did you have political conversations around the dinner table? Was it a lively conversation that was going on in the home all the time? Sounds fascinating.
So to my mother's dismay and my wife's dismay, yes.
Right, so they're probably like, let's just turn on the TV.
Yeah.
Speaking of the no TV.
Right.
I also love that in your talk, as I was reading ahead of time, just this idea of less TV, more bowling.
Yeah.
And
in leagues.
In leagues, more
you
bowling
gotta bowl
in leagues.
That's the key.
Can you talk a little bit, because we were talking beforehand, a little along those lines, you were saying that your talk has a healthy dose of cynicism in it. Can you talk a little more about where we go from here, how to carry on? What are the next steps? And just elaborate maybe in ways that you were not able to in your talk.
So obviously, this last election cycle invited a lot of spectator sport. People were very interested in this election, but I would humbly suggest the way that people participated in the level of discourse and oftentimes took an unhealthy turn. And I think part of that is, again, disillusionment. I think it was the choices that people had, but I still believe that fundamentally we are responsible. I'm sorry, responsibility begins with us. If we don't listen to negative campaigns and reward those things, then I assure you, they won't happen. The type of campaigns we're getting is because they work. On one hand, it's good that people are interested, okay? But that, again, has to be tempered and sobered by rational thought, analysis, and like I said, I love Joe Bassett's title of his book, A Mild Voice of Reason.
I see. How do you have any suggestions? I know personally, I have found it increasingly difficult to have healthy discussions about some of these topics. Do you have any words of encouragement or empowering thoughts to sort of have these gentle conversations or enriching conversations without going to the dark side or something like that?
So passion is a healthy thing. I'm not suggesting that we dampen passion. What I am suggesting is that we be more willing to listen to what other people have to say, even when we disagree with them. I can still respect your disagreeing with my position, but I think we have to be willing to be charitable about what it is you're saying so we don't have a dialogue of the deaf. Many people, when they find out their partisan affiliation, they already have a caricature in their mind of what that person is not only saying, but what the meaning of what they're saying. I think part of it is approaching it with an intellectual mindset of, let me hear what you have to say. Your conclusions, I may not agree with. I may not even think are valid, but your concerns, we may both be able to agree on, and then we can have a constructive dialogue about where we should go from here. And I think that we're not having those in real and meaningful ways. We're certainly not having them over public policy. Look at how much of the time of the campaign forget about talking about issues. Issues are abstract things, but concrete policy initiatives that relate to those issues, other than we need to get rid of Obamacare, and then President sits down at the desk and says, I was expecting a new health care to be waiting for me when I sat down, right? It's one thing to tear down the status quo, that's fine, okay? But then where do we go from here on a concrete level? That's a much deeper, much more serious, much more difficult kind of conversation.
Would you suggest that as we try to have these conversations that we kind of say something at the beginning of them, like, I'd like to have this kind of conversation? Or would you suggest, or and maybe both, that as individuals we just decide to listen more? I mean, should we say, let's have this conversation and let's agree to sort of have it in this mindset? What would be your suggestion?
Well, this deadlock that our leadership is engaged in right now is not a healthy thing. And, you know, there was a time in Congress, and I'm sure Doug would back me up on this, you know, when the congressional leadership actually controlled the agenda, would include both sides on the committee no matter who was in charge, and the turn in the 1990s to the party leaders taking over the agendas in Congress and controlling the committees was not a healthy thing. It turned it into a partisan competition where the intention was to exclude rather than include. We need to get back to inclusive conversations and make sure that, you know, that every voice is heard. And it doesn't mean that majority can't rule, but minority rights means the views of those who are not in the majority are also incorporated, respected, and integrated in a healthy and constructive way.
Great. A little bit of a shift. I know that you mentioned Paul Zak, and little teaser for next year. You might be hearing more from him. I'm fascinated by the topics of what he was talking with oxytocin and neuroeconomics.
Yeah.
And how those levels shift in the body. Yeah. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that and how you've interacted with those studies?
So it turns out that trust is also related to morality. Morality defined as a concept, if you want to go back to Adam Smith and his theory of moral sentiments, about the way, you know, what creates agreements, consensus, working together, and so forth, productivity. And so Paul Zak has sought to study those claims in a biological sense with oxytocin. It turns out that altruism is a big part of this. That morality basically comes down to how I'm willing to treat you and you me. And it turns out when I express generosity to you, or fidelity for the claims that you're making, you're going to do the same for me. It should be hardly surprising that if I cheat you, or you suspect that I'm going to cheat you, you're going to try to preempt me. It's like the golden rule, the modified golden rule is do unto others before they do unto you, right? It's this kind of thing. And so we need to start thinking about ways in which we can work together. Think about the endpoint of, we disagree, but we want to get to a place where even if we disagree, we can still get stuff done. And the way that happens from a biological perspective is I extend you a courtesy. The experimental economics research shows that in both laboratory games and also in the real world, that generosity initiated by one individual or charity initiated by one individual is going to create a reciprocity in the other. So, for example, in one of the games that Paul Zak does in his lab is I'm given $1, and I can't see you and you can't see me, and we both know that I'm given $10 and I can transfer $1 or all $10 to you, and whatever amount I transfer to you, Paul Zak will match. With the understanding that you have the ability but not the expectation or the requirement that you share that with me. The more generous I am up front, the data shows this, the more likely you are to return money back to me. And most individuals that have a baseline exhibition of oxytocin do this kind of thing pretty regularly. It turns out that it's not isolated. Now, there are people that are not predispositioned to doing this kind of behavior, and Paul Zak has a term for this in his lab for such people. They're called bastards. And as he says, These are not people you want to have a beer with, and they're not people you want to hang out with. But most of us, it turns out, are wired for generosity and reciprocity.
Well, that's a beautiful sentiment. I think that's a beautiful takeaway for us all to remember is to be charitable, be generous in whatever way that means to you. It's, of course, I'm sure, not just financial, with your time, with your efforts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Another question, do you have any, you were so diligent with your bibliography and your sources. Do you have any favorite books right now that maybe you could suggest to students who might want to read more about some of these topics?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the newspapers are filled with statistics about elections. You can go to, Congressional Research Quarterly. You can, the Congressional Record is full for all these kinds of things. But I would suggest, as I'm telling my comparative public policy class, let's start with an understanding of globalization. This is having such a tremendous effect on domestic politics and the way it shapes, and I'm not necessarily talking about interference from abroad in our elections. I'm talking about these forces that exist beyond our borders that are exerting internally, that is having an effect on our points of view and our internal relationships, domestic relationships with one another, within social groups, social classes, and so forth, that we really need to be aware of that, because it's no longer have the option to close these things out. These are things that are creating imperatives, and they're occurring from outside our borders. And this doesn't mean xenophobia. This doesn't mean to close out. This means to embrace, engage. I always tell people, what is it? It's think global, act local. I would suggest no, that's too reactive. You need to think local and act global. Act at the global level. Or if you want to think in another way, act local.
Wow, that's a complete shift to what you typically hear, but makes so much sense. Can you tell me how, with so many of the things that you've studied, how you came to this topic today? We talked a little bit about it before, but can you talk about why this particular paper, why this particular presentation now for you?
So I don't think it's any secret. I mean, this election disturbed me on so many levels, on a visceral level at my core. I have... I really, at times, my wife knows, became depressed about the whole thing. Someone who's always loved politics, been passionate about it. It got to the point where I didn't even want to watch the news. At times, I knew that I had to. And my colleague, Dan Swanson, says, "You didn't read today's paper, did you?" And he would call me out on stuff, and so I would force myself to do it. But it really got to the point where, it was very hard to watch. And so I felt that this would be a timely topic. I felt it's something that I had inside me that was storing up, and I thought maybe if I could say a few words to some of my colleagues, to some of our students, some of my friends, it would allow me to sort of, as a catharsis, to deal with some of this stuff. So it was a very personal endeavor for me on that level.
Did it help you find peace in a way?
It did, because it helped me kind of map out kind of where I think some of the problems lie. I didn't map them out all out fully. I had colleagues look at the original draft, and they said, "You didn't include this, you didn't include that," and that was fair enough. But I sort of spoke to the things that were more kind of on an individual, personal level in terms of concrete steps of how to deal with some of the stuff. Because at the end of the day, it is very personal, and it ought to be very personal. And my father made me read the Constitution when I was very young. I came to an early appreciation of that document. And in grad school, I came to a very important appreciation. You couldn't help going to Claremont with the Straussians there and the constitutional scholars like Kessler and all this. You develop an appreciation for its beauty. And when you consider it's the oldest living single document of a constitution that we have, I always say, so much of our notions of liberty that are institutionalized in that document come from the French, but they have now going on the fifth constitution. We still working on our first, still making this a more perfect union, and that's pretty humbling.
I didn't realize that. That's amazing. Yeah. Do you have, in closing, anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to share at this time?
Well, I'll just echo your plug. So Vernon Smith, the economist, Nobel Prize winner, is going to be here at SUU. He at first at a conference that we're hosting on March 30th, and then on the 31st here in the morning at SUU. And then, as you kindly mentioned, we've invited Paul Zak, and he has accepted to come for an Eccles visiting scholar, and that will be in October.
I think April.
Oh, sorry, April. Yes, sorry.
2019.
2019.
Amazing.
So yeah, so we're so whatever I didn't cover here, you'll have more than ample opportunity to engage and discuss with some of these folks.
Well, great. And the discussion continues. Today, Dr. Roy will be available in the lobby now for a few minutes if you'd like to have a moment with him or have a specific question that is burning in your mind. And then we will be on the radio at 3 p.m., and that's KSUU Thunder 91.1. And then I think you have an evening event later, and if you're interested in that, you definitely can let us know. Next week, we'll be in the Whiting Room just across the way, and we're going to sort of continue a little political theme, but much closer to home. We're having a round table of our SUUSA senators to kind of give their State of the Union and talk about some of the responsibilities, political parties, governance from the student government perspective. So we hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, a huge and heartfelt thank you so much to Dr. Ravi Roy, our 2018 Faculty Distinguished Lecturer. Thank you so much.
All of you. Wonderful.